Hi, how are you? Yeah, no post-lunch energy crisis in here? I am Alex Steffen, and I am here to talk to you about bright green strategies for thriving in tough times. And what that means in essence is that I think that we have in front of us a whole bunch of usually unseen solution spaces that can in fact allow us to take the current set of crises we face, economic, environmental, and so on, and transform them into opportunities to do things much better than we are now. That the future, the great hidden truth about the future is not how bad things are getting, but how good they could get. In order to kind of make sense of all this, although you guys are all pros, I thought it might be helpful to have a quick refresher course in planetary thinking to recall why exactly we need to be thinking about change, what are the drivers behind what we're needing to do. It's sort of traditional in talks that are dealing with the environment and energy and so forth to start with a whole bunch of scary facts. I'm going to skip the scary facts. I'm trusting that all of you got CC'd on the scary fact memo at some point here, and you all know that we are facing climate change, we are facing ocean acidification, we are facing all sorts of disruptions to ecosystems, toxic problems, etc. You guys know that things are bad, and that is a main driver in and of itself of a desire for change. But it's also worth remembering that even if we left the environmental impacts of things off the table, we still have a number of real big game-changing forces at work. One of them is that all the resources on this planet are either renewable or non-renewable. The non-renewable ones are ones that generally we mine in one form or another, and they all are strictly limited. There's only X amount on the planet. And we are beginning to face, at least coming into within sight, of the peak production of a whole bunch of those. Some people argue we've already passed the peak production of some, including oil. But the point being that these are all things that, as we have a growing population on a finite planet, will reach the point where they're no longer available in the way that we have taken for granted our entire lives that they would be. But even renewable resources, right, which generally are things that we grow or harvest, are themselves subject to strains. The fundamental nature of a renewable resource is that it's a system that generates abundance. So if you think about fisheries, for example, if you have a healthy fishery, you can take a bunch of fish out of it every year, and the fish will have more babies, and there'll be that fish there the next year. But the minute you start taking more fish out of that fishery than can be restored by the natural process, you start to actually upset the system. And at a certain point, you get to a crash. And what you end up with is a resource that was renewable that is now non-renewable, right? That is simply not coming back. And we've seen this happen with fishery after fishery after fishery all around the world, to the point that some people are now saying that we're sort of the last generation that's going to regularly wild ocean fish. That's a pretty big kind of tipping point. At the same time, we have a rising global middle class. I think that the rise of humanity out of poverty is probably the greatest success story in human history. So this is not a bad thing, right? The fact that billions of people have risen out of poverty and that we expect in the next 20 to 40 years much of the remaining population of the world to rise into sort of globally middle class standards. And for many people who are currently in globally middle class standards to rise into sort of developed world standard of living. This isn't a bad thing. This is a huge victory for humanity. But right now, when a person gets richer, they tend to live more like we do in the developed world. Right? That is sort of the definition of rich, is people start consuming resources, energy, et cetera, at rates that are much more like those in Europe, North America, China, Japan, than they are in sort of poorer societies. So at this rate, if we were to have 2 billion people living globally wealthy lifestyles, 4 billion people, or even 5 billion people living globally middle class lifestyles, that represents a gigantic strain on the planet, if they're living the way we do today, using similar kinds of systems. Furthermore, we are in a moment that is historically unique. We, not too long ago, became a species that is predominantly urban, right? There are now more people living in cities than outside of them. But that trend is actually accelerating. There are somewhere between 200 and 250,000 people a day either moving into cities or being born there, depending on which UN bureau you want to believe more. Point being, that's a lot of people. That's a city the size of Seattle every 3 days being built around the world. Between now and 2050, we're going to build 4,000 cities the size of Seattle. Right? 70% of the world's population, of roughly 9 billion people, we think, will be living in cities, but 95% of humanity will live within a day's travel of a city. And we know from experience that when people live within accessible distance of a city, even if they live in a rural place, their expectations change. They start to live more like urban people than like rural people from the past. So by the middle of the century, we're going to have a fairly crowded planet with an absolutely overwhelmingly urban perspective. In fact, between now and 2050, we're going to see the largest building boom in human history. And it's very likely to be the largest building boom for a long time to come as well, because we expect population will level off around the middle of the century, perhaps even begin to decline. But between now and then, the major thing that human beings are doing is building cities. And that means that every problem we face, including energy problems, becomes a city building problem. Right? Even if we're not used to thinking of them that way. That means that we need to start to look at things through some new lenses. I think one that most people in this room would probably totally get and agree with is that we need to go beyond thinking simply about energy generation. Right? For much of the recent past, we have thought about, when we come to think about energy, most North Americans think simply about making more of it, right? So we talk about energy security, energy demand increasing, et cetera. But not only because we are beginning to hit limits on fossil fuels and hit environmental problems, we are beginning to understand that thinking about energy simply as a generation problem just doesn't work, that we need more answers. If we have everyone on the planet beginning to use energy on the same kind of rising scales that we here in North America do, for example, it's probably simply impossible, even if we didn't care at all about environmental issues, to provide that much energy, right? But even more so, I think that while we definitely do need to care about environmental problems, and I'm really in favor of clean energy, I think we should build as much clean energy generation capacity as we possibly can. The fact is also that thinking of energy, thinking of climate as a generation problem may in fact prevent us from looking at where the really, really big possibilities for change are. One of the ways of thinking about this is to look at what do we use energy for. And there's this practice that's come into wider acceptance just in the last few years called consumption-based footprinting. How many of you are familiar with this? It's pretty new. Okay, so I'll explain it a little more. Consumption-based footprinting, normally when we footprint somebody's energy use or climate emissions or what have you, we basically talk about their direct use, right? So we say, oh, well, this person uses this much energy driving, this much energy heating their home, this much energy running their appliances. That's their energy footprint, right? Or we take the climate emissions from those kinds of activities, maybe even take it out a little step more, and we say that's their footprint. What we've come to realize, though, is that if you want an accurate picture of especially how North Americans live and use energy, you have to start to look not only at what we ourselves directly consume, but at everything we consume. Because there's energy going into things, embedded in all of the objects around us. There's energy serving the systems that make our lives possible, so on and so forth. The more that we start to count or attempt to count everything that we're using, the more we understand two things. One, our energy use and our carbon emissions are much higher than we generally think. And two, that much of the energy that we are using is an expression of the way that we have tried to meet needs, not of the needs themselves. That when we look at where the energy is being used, where the emissions are being created, where the pollution is being created, what we often see is that tied into this in a really deep way are fundamentally bad assumptions, outdated assumptions about the way that we provide prosperity. I'm going to give you one example. When we think of transportation, right, we tend to think of transportation as mobility, right? We think of transportation as getting in a car or some other kind of vehicle and going somewhere, right? That is because we presume that the way to provide access to the things we want in life is to move people around. This is a fundamental sort of modernist assumption about building cities, about modern transportation systems. But of course, that's not the only way to provide access to the things we want. There's a much simpler way, which is just to put them nearby us in the first place, right? To provide access by proximity. And because the most sustainable trip we're ever going to take is the trip we didn't take because what we wanted was already there, this can be a fundamental shift. And I'm not going to throw very many graphs at you today, but this is one that's worth noting. This is probably the best proven finding in urban planning, which is that as residential density rises, energy consumption on transportation falls. And it's very simple to understand why. As you have more and more people living in an area, you tend to have more and more services, more and more commercial possibilities, and people can simply get what they need close by. Doesn't hold perfectly true everywhere, and it's not a smooth curve for any given place. In fact, there can definitely be some major bumps along the way. This is, some of you may have heard of the 9-day traffic jam in China. There is a paradox here, at work here, which is that while it is definitely true that as places get denser, their energy use goes down for transportation and other things, as I'll discuss in a minute, it is also true that it doesn't happen uniformly. And there's this paradox of intensification, which is that as you have people moving into an area, many of them will switch how they use transportation, right? They'll start to shop more locally, perhaps walk more, take more public transportation, but not all of them. And so even though you have each person's use of a car declining, the aggregate use of cars goes up, right? So it's this paradox where things are getting better, but all of the manifestations get worse. And it's the one really nice thing about this is that we know enough to know that the paradox of intensification is something that at a certain point stops happening. We have lots of examples from around the world. Vancouver is a great one, of places that have pushed, in Vancouver's case, they call it eco-density, to the point where we've seen that curve break. Right? Vancouver, for example, is one of the few North American cities that's actually managed to talk people out of driving cars, right? Fewer cars per capita being owned, fewer vehicle miles being driven within the city, fewer people commuting by car, all of those things. And so we know that there is a point at which this happens. And if you get even denser than that, it in fact can happen much more quickly, especially if you add other services. So for example, public transportation. Who here's heard the term transit leverage? Anyone? Okay, a couple people. So this is kind of cool. When I read this, this blew my mind. So if I were to tell you, hey, we are going to put you on a train every day for a mile, on average, how many fewer miles are you going to drive that day? I would have said, in fact, I did say this when reading it, a mile, right? If I take a train for a mile, I'm driving a mile less. Makes sense to me, right? Well, but it actually turns out that it doesn't work that way. That for every mile people take public transportation, they drive 4 to 9 miles less, right? And the reason why is this, that when you take public transportation, you travel differently. You plan your travel differently. You do what's called trip stacking, right? You go, oh, I'm going to be walking over to the light rail station to take the train downtown to work, so therefore, on my way, I'm going to pick up this and that I might need. On the way home, I'm going to pick up some groceries, and in fact, I'll plan for lunch close to the office downtown rather than taking a separate trip for that. So boom, you've just eliminated a whole bunch of driving doing the same things that you normally do in a day. When you add more compact development with more transit service, you get an even multiplied effect. That's particularly true if the places that we're talking about are walkable, right? We've all been to places that are completely pedestrian hostile, right? The 8-lane road with no sidewalk, et cetera. We've all been to places where no sane person would walk. But we've all also been to places where the pedestrian is put first. And we know something happens in those places. In almost every case, when you make an environment that is focused on pedestrians, people walk a lot more, right? There's this concept of a walk shed, which is how far the average person will walk from where they are. It's roughly half a mile in most of North America. It's bigger generally for younger people, but it also grows depending on the nature of that area. Right? So if you have an area that's full of walkable streets and places where pedestrians feel really safe, they will walk much farther on an average trip. And we know that it's even possible to make these places temporary, right? That it's possible to fit in times of day when things are pedestrian focused. This is in Edinburgh, and part of the day you can drive on this street, and part of the day these bollards come up and prevent any cars from coming. Deliveries can come at certain times, et cetera. It's basically essentially a pedestrian mall that happens in certain hours. We also know that there are some other benefits to having a walkable area. One of them is that it's great for local business. We have this long time sort of inherited wisdom that turns out to be totally untrue, that if you want more traffic, if you want more customers at a business, you need more traffic going by. That's true for a very specific set of kinds of institutions, but not for most. By and large, somebody walking by is many, many more times more likely to shop in that store than somebody driving by. And so when you have very walkable, compact areas, what you get is what they're calling the place-making dividend. An example being in New York, when they closed off the streets around Times Square, they saw a 79% increase in sales in those retail businesses that year. There are plenty of other examples like that that aren't quite that dramatic. And you don't need to be, a walkability Nazi, right? We don't need to be crazy. We don't need to live in a biker's paradise to imagine really changing a lot of these things. Small shifts here and there, especially if they're done in a lot of different places in a coordinated way, really add up. One of the ways they add up that we're not used to thinking about is in terms of health. There's a lot of debate in the United States right now, but I know also in Canada about healthcare costs, health services, et cetera. Well, it turns out that one of the leading drivers of North American unhealthiness is cars. Cars are pretty much the worst things we do to ourselves. They're the most likely cause of death for people under the age of, I'm forgetting the statistic, but for most young people. They, in the United States, kill about 45,000 people a year, injure another million more. People who live in auto-dependent places are much more likely to have high blood pressure, suffer from heart disease, and obesity. Now, it may be true that fat, angry people like to move way out in the suburbs, but probably the correlation works the other way around, right? That really living far out in the burbs and being totally auto-dependent is really bad for our health. Now, a lot of people say, well, that's all great, but I don't have time to walk, right? I don't have time to bike. And there's a researcher in Seattle named Alan Durning, really, really smart fella, and he walks to work. Takes him a half an hour each way every day. And people would say, you run this think tank, you're a researcher, you're internationally acclaimed, how can you have time to spend an hour a day walking? And being, a quant kind of guy, he ran the numbers. And he's like, well, I better figure out exactly what my opportunity costs are here. And what he found is that the life expectancy gain from walking an hour is actually much more than an hour every day. So actually he wasn't spending any time at all walking because the time he spent walking was time he would have spent dead. So, you know, there are some real benefits here. In addition, compactness has a lot of other interesting effects that we really didn't know to look for until fairly recently. One of them is that green building, it turns out, works much, much better in compact communities for a number of different reasons. One of them has to do with multifamily buildings, right? Buildings that have several units. Such buildings are inherently more sustainable than single-family detached units for very simple reasons in terms of shared walls, the efficiency of having essentially units insulating each other, and so forth. But beyond that, it turns out that there's also some really great synergies here. This is Bjarke Ingels, who's sort of a rock star Danish architect right now. He does a lot of sustainability-related stuff, a lot of really edge-pushing stuff. I recommend his TED Talk to you. He's, I think, a very brilliant guy. This is his project, The Mountain, in Copenhagen. Every one of these units has its own outdoor space, its own little bit of garden, et cetera. They also utilize passive solar and very high efficiency, such that even in Copenhagen, these units require very little heating and cooling. And of course, it's possible to integrate even larger systems in here as well, to talk about integrating energy and water into the building. This is the Bullitt Center, which is under construction in Seattle. And it will, when built, be a net zero water building. So it plans to produce all of its own power and harvest all of its own water, more or less, on site. Now, there are some real problems here. They originally planned to have this be a residential building, but it turns out that residential units use enough more energy and much more water that it just simply wasn't possible within this building envelope to do it. So now these are all office spaces. But I think, you know, so we have to, you know, temper our enthusiasm. But I do think that it's very cool that we're moving towards a time when we're beginning to understand that we can actually integrate systems into compact areas and get much better performance. This is also backed up by something that I find really interesting, at least, which is that people who live in more compact communities actually use less of almost everything. This is a pretty interesting design in San Francisco, where I now live, where housing is unbelievably expensive, especially now that Facebook has made all sorts of new millionaires. This design is basically an affordable housing unit for a single young adult. Somebody who already lives out and about on the town can live in this sort of high quality single residency unit, basically. Now, I'm not suggesting that everybody's going to want to live in like 500 square feet, but I think it's a very interesting thing that this is a market-driven building here. This is something people are doing for profit, recognizing that, first of all, our households are getting smaller. This is true everywhere in the developed world, but especially true in North America, right? That people are marrying later, divorcing more frequently. People are, with the exception of the last couple of years, generally not living with their kids after they leave the house. You know, we are more and more a culture that most people, at least, will go through some time where they live alone. But we haven't built to that. And when you build to that, you in fact find that, you know, a single person living in a 3-bedroom apartment, yeah, that's a lot less energy efficient than a single person living in a more effective use of space. But even beyond that, people, when they live in more compact communities, in smaller households, use less stuff for the simple reason that it makes a lot more sense not to have it. My favorite example of this being a gym. You don't find a lot of home gyms in apartments that look like this, right? People who live in really dense urban areas belong to gyms. They don't own them, right? And when you have 500 people sharing 50 pieces of equipment, it's a hell of a lot more energy effective than having, you know, each person, each of those 500 households owning its own equipment. And this translates again and again and again in consumption. Now, you might ask, that's all fine and good, but where do we get the density, right? Maybe you live in a place that right now Density is not the strong suit, and it has other virtues. Well, one of the great things about the moment that we're in is that the challenge that we face of increased urbanization, right? Populations are growing, especially in North America, right? Both the US and Canada expected to see some pretty strong population growth. More and more demand for urban living, both on the older end of the spectrum and the younger end of the spectrum. But also, we have a tool now to channel that growth, which is that we're beginning to understand that density doesn't work like a blanket, right? For a long time, planning, when we talked about density and averages, units per acre and so forth, we tended to think about it as a pretty uniform kind of thing, that this area would be that dense. And it would basically be that dense most of the area, right? And then we'd have another area over here that would be a different density, and most of it would be that density. But we're finding that that both is unnecessary and doesn't really work very well. And especially if we want to make quick changes in places, we need to think about something that is more accurate, which is that density is an average, density as actually experienced by people is an average of what happens in your walk shed, right? So it doesn't matter necessarily if the whole area is one kind of density. It matters how many different places can you get to in that walk shed. Meaning that if you have a corridor or a old neighborhood core or a place of some developments that are much more dense, they effectively raise the density of everything around them, even if those things don't change. What I call tentpole density, right? That instead of being like a blanket, it's like a tent. That if you put a bunch of density in one spot, it raises the effective density of all the rest around it. Melbourne, in particular, Melbourne, Australia, has encountered this and has really thought about it in a fairly deep way. They are experiencing rapid population growth. There's a fierce fight there about whether to blow through their green belt and start developing their open spaces. And the city of Melbourne itself decided that they would do a study about the metropolitan region and figure out, well, what would it take to not do that? And they did this study, the corridor study, where they basically took everything you wouldn't want to develop off the table. So they said, we're generally going to leave single-family neighborhoods completely alone because people don't like it when you build a 10-story building next to their house, right? We're going to leave all industrial land alone. We're going to leave all park land alone, et cetera. And we're only going to build in places that already have transit service very nearby. And what they did is they found that there was enough land that fit that description in Melbourne to add another 2 million people. And that not only would that solve the problem of not needing to sprawl out, it would actually mean that each of the places around those areas experienced all sorts of benefit. They would take places like this, make them places like this, make them like this. And what they found was that if they concentrated this on basically a half block along the corridors where the transit already runs, they wouldn't need to touch anything else around it. People who lived in the single-family neighborhoods around there would still live in single-family neighborhoods, except for now they would experience them as much more compact communities. They'd have places to walk to grab a bite to eat, to go shopping, et cetera. And you'd get all the benefits of compact density for those places. And we know that it's possible to take places that are really not built for that kind of density and repair them. This is from the Sprawl Repair Kit, really great book. Just one example of many of the kinds of land use that can take suburban, auto-focused, very low-density areas and start to turn them into things that become building blocks of more walkable, compact communities. And of course, we're starting to see lots of this around the world. This is from Seattle, where I used to live. It's part of a dead mall retrofit. Northgate Mall, one of the first malls in North America, in steep decline for years. They basically said, we're going to make this a major transit hub, and we're going to build it to very high densities. And this is one of the first projects here, where they're infilling the parking lots and creating, instead of a big hole of parking in the middle of a fairly nice set of residential neighborhoods, a new sort of downtown core, if you will. This stuff works. We know it works. And it enables, in a fairly short time, a place to transform, to change, without having to change every aspect of what it's doing. And I think that density has one major flaw, which is that most people don't like to live in really dense places that are gray and unfriendly, and a lot of us have experienced nasty development, right? Places we wouldn't want to live. I think that one of the things, besides just good building practices, that can lead to changing the experience of density is green infrastructure. Now, when I say those words, a lot of people think like this. This is Vancouver's propaganda about how it is the greenest city in the world. And there is this tendency when you say green and anything urban for people to start imagining leaves, right? So you tell architects we're interested in a green community, and the first thing they do is break out the green crayons, right? They make plans like this, or like this, or like this, or like this. You get the idea, right? But the real thing about green infrastructure is not that it, looks like nature. That's not really that important. It's that it works like nature and creates a good place. So this is LMN. The architecture firm did a green roof on the convention center in Canada that actually performs valuable ecological services as well as providing some visual green and some open space. And this is a neighborhood in Stockholm that takes the whole concept further and actually takes the wastewater from the area, treats it in natural processes mostly, and then releases it back into the river as clean water, connects the development right back to the river that it borders, the inlet that it borders. We know that it is possible to start to build cities where the infrastructure, especially the water infrastructure, starts to work more like nature. And that when you do that, you also gain the ability to really soften some of the edges of density. Now, there's a problem here, which is that it's really hard sometimes to look at something like this and know whether it's actually working or just appears to work, right? This could very well just be a bunch of plants, like jammed in between those concrete walkways, right? Looking at this picture, you just don't know. I have it on good authority that that's not what's happened, but it's hard to tell. In order to tell, you have to really understand the systems. You have to be able to start to think about the system that it's affecting. And that's why I think one of the critical tasks facing us as we try and reimagine cities and reimagine the use of energy and resources within those cities is systems storytelling. That we start to learn how to tell stories to folks about systems that are really complex. In some cases, systems that are so complex that nobody actually really understands them. Right? I sat next to a Boeing engineer on a flight a couple years back, and we were talking about this and that. It's a long flight. He was a nice guy. And so at one point, I'm like, so do you understand everything about this plane? And he kind of laughed. Right? And he said, oh, yeah, not only do I not understand everything about this plane, no one does. There's no human being on Earth who could tell you what every part in a Boeing plane, where it came from, what it does, and how it interacts with every other part. It's too complex a system for any person to understand, right? And that's why you have a giant corporation with lots of checks and balances and processes for quality control and et cetera, et cetera. The corporation, as an abstract entity, understands the plane as a system very well, but no person can. And I would argue that in many cases, we're already surrounded by tons and tons and tons of systems that work that way. And so it becomes even more important to start to give people a general sense of how the system works, so that when there's a change, when there's an expectation of a new behavior, when there's a shift in how things that happen around them is occurring, that they get it and they support it. And some of this stuff can be really playful. These are two representations of water systems. The one on the left trying to explain sort of the backstory of the water system in a residential area. The one on the right being a sort of whimsical German rainwater capture system that just recalls for people briefly the idea that they're connected to a system, an urban system of rainfall and drainage that has certain possibilities. Some things are really simple and direct, right? This is connecting people back to the understanding that their sewers are connected to the river, that there's a system there, and if they dump toxic stuff down it, they're killing fish in that river, right? Some of these things are a little more complex, and with new technologies, we're gaining more and more abilities to do this, right? That I assume everyone in this room knows about the Prius effect, right? Can I see a show of hands? Generally, you've heard about it. Okay, maybe I'll do a quick run through of this, because this is kind of cool. Like, if you have two cars that are identical in every way, except for that one of the cars has a mileage meter and the other doesn't, the one with the mileage meter gets better mileage, right? How can that be? They're the exact same car. Everything that's physically, that would physically dictate the mileage is exactly the same, right? Well, it turns out that when you have a car with a mileage meter, you start to drive better, right? You notice that you're supposed to be getting X mileage, and every time you floor it out of a red light, your mileage drops a little bit, right? Every time you drive a little bit under the speed limit, it goes up a bit. You start to be trained about what behaviors you as a driver engage in that affect the mileage, right? In essence, the car with the mileage meter makes you a better driver. And we're finding that this is true for all sorts of things. As I'm sure many people in this room know, when you measure something and you put it in front of people, they change their behaviors. It happens in all sorts of ways. But it turns out that when you measure something and you put it in front of people and you tell them how they compare to other people, things change like that, right? That nobody wants to be the worst, right? In fact, most people want to be like towards the top, right? And so you gain instantly these abilities when you have data, the ability to absorb data about people's behaviors and their impacts to get people slightly competitive about what they do and thinking, again, about the systems of which they are a part, right? We're going to have more and more of this. But sometimes what's needed is actually also more cultural than data-driven. These are two approaches. One is, continue polluting, and soon you may not have a choice with a straw in a dirty river. The other is from Holland, and the Dutch have a wonderful directness, and it says, if the water reached this level, we would not need the bridge. Drive on, maybe we will achieve this. Right? These are both sort of direct and playful ways of reminding people that they're connected to systems, in this case, a water system and a climate system. And I think that we're going to see more and more and more of this kind of thing because we need it. We need people to understand the systems in order to support the changes. This is going to get easier, I think, in some ways, because we are suddenly able to use a whole bunch of technologies that just simply didn't exist before. How many people in this room have a phone that can pick up a map, that you can pull up a map on? How many people had one 10 years ago, right? We are living suffused in environments that are absolutely suffused with technology. And it's hard for us to really grasp. It's one of those things that, like, we're the frog in that gradually, heating pot of water. It's hard for us sometimes to really grasp how much things are changing. One of the things that's changing is we're probably the last generation that's going to know what it means to get lost. I talk to younger people a lot, and I realized a while back that when I was talking to younger people, I actually had to explain to them in some contexts that there was a time before Google, right? Because they've all grown up using Google. They think that the internet came with Google, right? That that's the way it was built. And I have to tell them the story about there was the time of directories, right? There was 5 years in there or so where, and if you wanted to find something online, you had to go to a directory. And a directory, of course, was a list of websites that were like something else, right? Not sorted in any way. You couldn't find what you needed in there. You had to go one by one, go down it, click links, right? Driving around in cities is like using a directory. Walking around with a cell phone is like using Google. We haven't really caught on to that yet. One of the first things that happens when we have a cell phone with a map is that we start to find out where other things are. One of the first things we want to find out is where our friends are. And it turns out that having access to both walkable neighborhoods and mobile technology greatly increases people's social time. There used to be this idea that the internet was going to make us all sort of housebound geeks with feeble limbs, right? That nobody would ever go outside again. It turns out that the exact opposite is true. That the more friends you have online, the more people you're likely to know in the real world. And that the more people, the more compact the community you have, the more you're likely to see them in person. This is kind of almost exactly the opposite of what we believed would be happening, but it's happening in every city around the world right now. And I think there's a reason for it, which has not only to do with the fact that people like people, you know, we're essentially all chimps, we like to hang out, but also that we are, I think, discovering that there's a real joy simply in feeling connected through space with somebody or something. I think this is best represented in everything I've seen by my friend Zay Frank's project, If the Earth Were a Sandwich, which I think is an important project, so I'll read the mission statement. Never before have two pieces of bread been simultaneously placed on the ground directly opposite each other on the globe, thus making an Earth sandwich. The fact that the Earth has never been a sandwich is probably why things are so fucked up. Now, this is a really geeky project. It involves two people on opposite sides of the planet talking on their phones, looking at GPS, holding a piece of bread. When they are exactly opposite each other on the planet, each of them takes that piece of bread and puts it on the ground, and you've now made an Earth sandwich, right? Pretty geeky. Who would want to spend vacation days, for example, doing this? Who would want to go out of their way to do something like this? Well, actually, it turns out a lot of people. It turns out that a phenomenal number of people want to make the Earth a sandwich, and the Earth has been made a sandwich from almost every imaginable angle, right? And I think the reason why is because there's something that's just purely joyful about having a sense of connection through a distance with somebody or something that you care about. When you have that kind of ability to track things, you also suddenly get the ability to understand how space around you works. This is, for example, apartment search from WalkScore. It's very simply, you tell it, I want to take this kind of transit to this place. I can pay this amount of money, I'm looking for this kind of apartment, and it will map all of the available apartments in a city that fit those criteria. So essentially, like if you want to live, you know, a light rail lifestyle and you can spend $1,200 on an apartment, you'll find it on this mapping service. Some of them are really simple, some of these ways of understanding place and ourselves and how we move through it. iNap is just simply an app that you tell it what station or stop you get off on transit, and at the stop or station before, it rings your alarm to make sure you don't sleep past your stop. There's all sorts of amazing things. Google Walking Maps, for example. Now, this, you know, not all these things are perfect. I asked Google Walking Maps how to walk the Greater Ridgeway, the oldest walking trail on Earth, and it told me to go via Guernsey. There's one small problem. The Guernsey is an island in the middle of the English Channel. It did, however, helpfully tell me that walking directions are in beta and I should use caution as this route may be missing sidewalks or pedestrian paths. So, you know, it did kind of cover itself that way. There's also augmented reality, which is the ability to look around us at the spaces that we're moving through a digital lens. It essentially allows us to see information layered over things that are too stupid to have any information in them themselves, right? So the concrete can't tell you very much, but if you have this program from LAR, it will take you to the nearest tube stop in London simply by pressing a button, holding up your phone, and turning around, and it'll go, walk this way, now take a left, you know? This kind of thing is going to become more and more the case as people who live in dense urban environments and have access to a lot of walk-shed technologies start to want to be able to essentially leave trails for each other, to use the pedestrian environment more effectively. Another thing that walk-shed technologies facilitate is delivery. Delivery, as you may know, is inherently more sustainable than driving somewhere and buying something. It is much more sustainable to have a single van taking a computer-drawn route to deliver items to 100 stops than it is to have 100 people driving to the store and parking and driving home. There's one big problem with delivery in urban environments, which is that if people leave stuff on your stoop, it's likely to get ripped off, right? And that really is less sustainable than driving to the store. So actually, the Germans came up with a great thing that's now being picked up all around the world called a pack station. What happens is the delivery van comes to the pack station on your block, it loads the various packages in there, and it sends you a text. And you walk to the pack station when you have a moment, you enter the text in the keyboard, you know, there's a code, it gives you your package. Safe, convenient package delivery. And I think that we're just at the beginning of seeing this kind of change. Here's a sign that I saw in Seattle. So this guy, you buy something on Craigslist, and this guy will go pick it up for you, because a lot of people who live in dense parts of Seattle don't own cars. That's all pretty straightforward. I don't know if the guy's any good. I wouldn't vouch for his business, but you know, it makes sense. It's a useful thing to do. But I would also submit to you that nothing on this sign would have made any sense at all to any of us 10 years ago, right? This is a completely different niche. It's taking us into a world of surplus capacities. What do I mean by that? Well, the things around us, we buy because we want to use them, by and large. Most of the time, the amount of use we get from them is much less than the amount of use they have in them, right? But when you don't know where anything is, like where basically the best way to be sure that you can get your hands on something is to have it in the garage, although in my case that wouldn't be a very good guide of anything. But like, it suddenly becomes important to own them, right? Or doesn't suddenly, it has been important to own them. However, there is a fundamental problem here. Who here owns a home power drill? Okay, so most people in the room. The average home power drill gets used somewhere between 6 and 20 minutes in its entire lifetime. Right? Most people buy power drills, like I bought mine, because you have a specific job you want to do. In my case, I needed to drill some holes, hang some pictures, and thought it would be convenient for some other tasks. Most of its life, my power drill has spent sitting on a shelf gathering dust. Right? I paid whatever it was, $149, I think, or something, and I've used it, maybe 5 minutes. Not only the money went into that, though, but a lot of energy and resources. Right? It takes a lot of energy and resources to mine, package, sell, et cetera, this kind of appliance. Now, what I wanted was not the drill. Right? I have never sat up in the middle of the night and gone, my God, I need that power tool. Right? I do not have an emotional craving for power tools, although this kid, I think, shows us that it is possible to have such a craving. What I wanted was a hole in the wall. What I got was the drill. That's a perfect example of buying a surplus capacity, especially when there are all sorts of models out there now that will connect you to that capacity without needing to own the thing. There are tool sharing services, tool rental services that will deliver the tool to you, tool sharing libraries, right? There are programs that will connect you with your neighbors for informal swaps on things like neighbor goods. There are just a huge number of ways that you can get a power drill without buying the damn thing, right? And if you imagine every person in this room multiplied by, all 400 million or so North Americans, you can imagine how many power drills are sitting vacant. Now, we could try and come up with more ways to use those drills. We could cook with them, build ice sculptures, make jack-o'-lanterns, perhaps even do some mafia hits, right? But really, the much, much, much more sensible thing is to start to imagine our lives differentiating things that we own because we really care about them and things that we own simply because we want to use them at some point. Right? And for many of those things, we can offload those. We don't need to actually have those around, especially when you live in a dense urban environment, or even a moderately dense urban environment, with walk-shed technologies and the ability to sort of see these different business models emerging. Right? That we are more and more going to live in a cloud of availability of services that used to be products. Right? So you will live in a cloud, we already do live in a cloud of availability of drilling service. You can hire a drilling service, right, in all sorts of different ways. It makes a lot more sense for a lot more people to do these kinds of things. And that model is spreading out. Japan, as always, leads us to the weirdest edges of things. This is a cat-sharing cafe, so that people, mostly young women who live in places where they can't have cats, can come and experience cat love for a little while. Bizarre, but there you have it. But we're also beginning to see things that are really, truly innovative combinations of locational technologies, product service systems, and different ways of looking at these business models. This is Car2Go, for example, which is a rental not a rental car service, it's a car sharing company, right? And car sharing is a big deal, a very fast growing thing. But car sharing usually has one problem. And it's best typified, I think, by the problem of bike sharing in Barcelona. So Barcelona started Beasing about 5 years ago. It's a bike sharing service that set the trend sort of around the world for these, bike share companies. And they found quickly that they had one major flaw. People loved it, right? Incredibly popular. Thousands of bikes at hundreds of stations, very successful, right? Except for that they found that people tended to ride the bikes downhill, right? So they would end up with giant piles of bikes at all of the stations that were at the bottoms of the hills and no bikes at the stations that were at the top, right? So they found to make the system useful, they actually had to hire some guys with trucks and just continually move the bikes back up the hills, right? Still a great service and still an ecological win. Car2Go is sort of a similar idea. Car share companies right now generally, even though it's very convenient, right? I can walk down the street, I can have my phone, I can go, oh, I need a car, I can open a browser, look for the nearest car, make a reservation, go use my swipe card, get into it, drive away. That's pretty darn convenient, except for you have to bring it back. And just the same way that most people will only want to ride the bikes downhill, most people don't want to have to drive to a place, do their stuff, and drive exactly back to the same place. Car2Go basically completely shifts that. It tracks where all the cars are. If there's a need for cars, they move them. And it basically just allows you to use a car as you would your own car. Just drive it wherever you're going to go. And this stuff is happening in more and more and more ways. Who's here heard of the phenomenon of pop-up stores? I see show of hands. OK, so a few folks. So a pop-up store is a pretty simple concept, really, that's only become practical recently. A pop-up store is where there's a retail space that's empty. And a business person, an entrepreneur, often young people, go to the owner of that space and say, hey, while this space is empty, let me rent it from you at a low price temporarily. I'll pop up a store within it. Now, for business owners, this works out great because they get some rent. They're also drawing people into the place, so people are seeing that that space is available, right? And they're helping to create some vitality. For the pop-up entrepreneur, it makes a lot of sense because they suddenly have a business, right? They've always dreamed of opening a restaurant or a fashion boutique or whatever, and now they can do it for a little while. Very low overhead, a chance to prove themselves, a chance to get backers, and so forth. But this only works because of Walkshed Technologies, right? Because nothing about this model would make sense 20 years ago, right? Because you used to think about things like, oh, you've got to advertise for X amount of time before people will come, you got to build up your brand reliability, blah, 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 right? There's all these things you have to do to make retail work when the only way to reach people is basically television, the newspaper, or having them drive by and see it, right? Pop-up stores essentially are online communities that manifest in a specific place. That's why they work, right? Because nobody starts a pop-up store with no friends on Facebook, right? And so these things actually can be incredibly profitable for the people involved simply because they already have all their customers, right? They get a cheap space, they get some great, they get some cheap display cases and stuff, and suddenly all of their customers who are out there already connected to them are there shopping, right? It's starting to happen that we're seeing pop-up go bigger. This is in Brixton. It's an area of town there that had a lot of ground floor retail that was empty, a lot, kind of a blighted area. And a nonprofit went to one of these retail storefronts and said, hey, can we move our office in here until you find somebody else? We're looking for cheap rent, but at least there'll be some people around, right? Reduce the vandalism. And it worked so well so immediately for them that they said, and the other owners got interested. And so they basically put together a service where they connected a whole bunch of people who wanted to start up little startup businesses in pop-up spaces with a whole bunch of owners. And this entire street that you're seeing is pop-up stores, right? It's essentially a pop-up commercial district, right? And it's going gangbusters. Very, very successful. And that model has started to spread. So now you have pop-up hood in Oakland, for example, which is a similar thing that's just getting going, but getting going from the start intended to do that. There's a way here that you're seeing a pretty incredible transformation happen in a way that looks kind of mundane, right? But the idea that we could use technology to make use of vacant storefront spaces, right? To make use of surplus capacities, right? Rather than have to go through the whole process of building a new space that will accommodate them. That's a kind of breakthrough. In fact, I think that when we're talking about energy, about resources, about climate, that's the real breakthrough, right? The real breakthrough is understanding that we have more adaptive capacity right now than we have ever had, by far, by orders of magnitude. We can do things now that literally were impossible 10 years ago and that nobody had even imagined 20 years ago. And that there's this amazing opportunity happening. As the world gets more urban, more connected, as cultures connect more, as we start to see people having a more metropolitan, even cosmopolitan attitude, and share solutions across national borders, talk to people in other cities, diffuse innovation, we start to gain the capacity to do things in really new ways. It is critically important that we have new technologies, that we that we look at our networks and energy grids and start to reimagine them. That we look at things like rate structures and incentives and all those things. All those things, of course, matter a lot, right? And we should be working on those. But I would put to you that the real breakthrough here, again, is not in that stuff. Because that's all stuff that talks about how do we deliver what we already knew we wanted in a better way. The real breakthroughs are finding out that what we wanted was something different all along. And I think that people who start to look at problems that way, start to ask first when they see a problem, are we even talking about the right problem, right? Are we even trying to solve the right challenge here? Are going to be the ones who really thrive over the next 10, 20 years, right? Because when you invent something that shifts the whole system, that changes the user experience about how a place works, how a product works, right? You become instantly globally competitive. And that is a pretty good space to be, I think, where you suddenly are doing something that is helping to drive forward the economy of your area, the business that you're in, helps the people who you represent, but that's also achieving a big leap in terms of solving the kinds of huge planetary problems that we know we face and have to deal with. So I'll leave you with some words from Paul Hawken, a writer I really admire a lot, who says simply that you are brilliant and the earth is hiring. And I'll ask you to take the job. Thank you very much.
Sorry, this is just a small token of our appreciation from the Region of Peel and its partners to just thank Alex for just a great talk today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think it's a power drill. Yeah. Hey, thank you. Yeah. Now, do you want to do a few questions?
Sure, if you'd like. We do have some time for questions if anybody has any of Alex. And I believe we could please step up to the microphones that are located in the middle of the aisleways here.
Yes.
Is this on? Hey, that's good. Just wanted you to comment on I guess, used to be the word green, now maybe a little bit more shifting towards sustainability and the lack of substance to those words now, and whether you see a time where we can get rid of those words because green doesn't exist anymore because that's the way we do things. Just love a comment about that.
Well, yeah. There's an inherent problem when you're talking about shifting a whole bunch of different people's behaviors and practices across a whole bunch of different fields, a whole bunch of different cultures, which is that, on the one hand, we want to encourage and reward people who do anything, right? Like we want to say, hey, okay, you made that step, great, good for you. At the same time, we also know that we live in a world of pretty hard, harsh realities. We know that we have definite, measurable limits to the kinds of strains that we can put on the planet. And we know that we are bumping hard up against those limits. So there's this challenge of, on the one hand, wanting to be able to say, hey, you did something. Good, you're greener than you were. But on the other hand, needing to kind of also have some targets there that help us understand whether you're anywhere like near green enough with what you're doing. I don't have the answer to that, but I think it's a pressing problem. I do think that as we're starting to see more precision about the kind of climate goals that we need to have, we're starting to understand that in some ways, CO2 and related emissions can serve at least as a kind of stopgap measurement there, because it's pretty concrete stuff. But I think that it's still an active challenge.
Hi, Faisal Karmali from Quincy. We do social benchmarking for residential energy use. And we're leveraging mobile technology. You were talking about transit leverage and about the kind of miles that are saved. Are you aware of studies or even your experience in terms of savings in energy also having increased leverage, the way a saved mile using transit translates to 4 to 9? We've got an energy audience here. How does that apply to energy? What's the potential there?
Well, I mean, so there's lots of like sort of EROI kind of stuff, right? You know, you insulate this home, it takes this amount of energy to do it, but you save X amount of energy over time. That stuff, there are people who are much, much more expert than I who can address it. The things that I'm particularly interested in right now are the things where you just stop doing something altogether because of a shift in possibilities within a system. And I think we're starting to see more and more of those, or even where using something the old way doesn't make much sense. One of the things that I thought was really interesting is a study that came out not that long ago that was talking about why Gen Y in particular, the millennials in particular, have made this huge shift away from cars and are really, by large numbers, preferring urban environments and transit. And one of the things that they found in their poll that I thought was interesting was that one of the leading reasons for that is that you can use your iPad or iPhone while you're on the train, and you can't really do it when you're driving, right? So to people who are really heavily connected, driving seems like dead time. Right? And I think that's a really interesting kind of shifter there, right? Where the service that's expected changes completely. I don't know if that's answering your question. Okay.
Hey, how's it going? You talked a lot about how social changes are basically going to be the main driver for a lot of these kinds of things. You also mentioned how everyone has an iPhone. They can all it's that connection to the masses. How would you say that can be implemented to put together some kind of incentives for the masses to kind of move towards, where we're hoping to move society as a sustainable society? So how would you do it?
Well, I mean, there are various kinds of economic incentives that people are doing. Those are interesting. I expect that people in this room are aware of those. What I find more interesting are what are the other kinds of incentives that people can have. What's the cognitive science stuff there? What's the system storytelling stuff? That turns out that people are actually really bad at judging almost anything. And so, including me. And so it really helps to have little cues that help people understand what they should be looking at instead. I showed the mock-up of the bill that compares an outrageous energy user to other users. That's just one of a billion things that people can do to kind of like draw out that system, draw out those comparisons. I think that it is an avenue of communication that almost all the players in this general field of sustainability underinvest in, that we spend so much time trying to pressure people to do things, right, or trying to essentially bribe them to do them, that we forget that a lot of times people already want to do them, they just don't know what they are. And that there are ways of revealing those things, through describing these systems and showing people their role in and that those things can be pretty profound and not only change behavior, but actually change the way people see the whole deal. So, yes?
Hi. I'm a country dweller. Your portrait of the future scares the hell out of me.
Okay.
It sounds like it's a world of megacities where you send out work crews out into the environs to find all the raw materials you have. But all of the communities of 1,000 people or less simply disappear because all of the jobs, all the connections are in the megacities. Am I missing something? What happens, to my breed?
First of all, I'll tell you, it isn't my vision of the future. I'm describing where the trends are headed. And I think that there are some very good reasons to be worried about that. I think especially when we're talking about communities that are resource-based, right? Farm communities, forest communities, et cetera. You know, frankly, we've done a terrible job of promoting the stability and strength of those communities, you know? It's happened all throughout the plains, right? We've seen collapses of all these farming counties and depopulation and so forth. You know, it's happened in a lot of timber-oriented communities where we've completely failed to find a sustainable cut, and we've also completely failed to buffer those communities in any way from the consequences of that unsustainable harvest, right? I think it's a huge problem. I think it's a very different problem in some ways from the problems of urbanization, which is where the vast majority of humanity are going to be. It's pretty clear. And you know, personally, what I'd like to see is a much different way, again, through system storytelling, of connecting urban people to rural places and rural communities so that people understand there's a backstory here. Your food came from somewhere, you know? The wood that chair's built out of came from somewhere, that you have a connection to these places. I think that ultimately that helps everybody involved. And I think there's some desire for that. I think, you know, if you look at the explosion of farmers markets, I think that's an indicator. It's not a solution, but it's an indicator that, or at least it's not the whole solution, it's an indicator that people actually care about where stuff comes from and want to feel some connection back, you know? I personally believe that many of the problems that rural communities have in North America have to do much more with government policies and industrial practices than with housing preferences, essentially. Right? They're big, mega scale kind of stuff. I do know, I've spent a lot of time in rural Northern California. I do know that if the choice is simply the choice that young people have been presented with for a century and a half now, right? Which is either stay and live in a culturally limited environment and be poor, or move to the city, get richer, live longer, have more opportunities, that almost all young people will take the choice to move. We've seen that all around the world for decades now, right? It's what's hollowing out the middle of North America. I think that there's a different way we could do it, right? I think that we could, in fact, start to think about how do we really create more opportunities for young people in places? How do we talk about the next generation of farmers, the next generation of foresters? How do we start to shift some cultural values so places are more inclusive? I've probably gone on way too long, but it's something that I think a lot about, and I think your concern is entirely valid. I'm not sure I've addressed it, but. Yes?
Thank you for the presentation. It was inspiring. I want to talk, though, about the other end of the spectrum. I want to talk not so much about the young people that are adopting technology and embracing change. I want to talk about the grumpy old men at the other end of the spectrum that are resisting change. And who would have thought in a province like this that I used to describe as quite advanced on environmental education, that we would have the pushback against green energy, wind turbines, solar panels, you name it, that we've seen in this province? Who would have thought that ICLEI would be characterized by the American Tea Party as a UN plot to
Exactly.
force Americans off the land into cities where they can be controlled?
Yeah.
You know, and there are people out there who think this way.
This is a big problem. I'm not going to speak to Canadian politics because I don't know well enough to speak to it. But I will say that in the US, the really amazing thing is there's a hardcore percentage, about 15% of the population, that is fiercely against the idea of acknowledging climate change, fiercely against earth management, fiercely against like energy efficient light bulbs, right? I mean, and the crazy thing is that they're the same people, right? It's the same 15% of the population. And they tend to be white males over 50. That's sort of the core of that crowd. And I don't honestly know what the heck is going on there. You know, I think some of it may have to do with a cultural thing, which is that one of the things we're learning out is a lot of the stuff we're learning now is that a lot of the stuff that we've been doing for decades, in hindsight, was somewhat off to really terrible, right? There are chemicals, for example, that we've been using for decades that it turns out were terrible ideas. You know, endogen disruptors, for example. You know, it turns out climate emissions, huge, gigantic problem that we've been, you know, actively working away to create for, you know, for the better part of 150 years. And I do think that it's probably pretty tough for somebody who is really proud of the work that they've done with their lives, who's worked hard, has pride in their command of that field, you know, feels like they poured their lives into creating something, to then turn around and recognize that that thing has unintended consequences or perhaps even is just awful. And I do wonder how much of this is just an understandable human reaction, right? That none of us wants to turn around and find ourselves, you know, in the latter part of our career or latter part of our lives as the bad guy, you know? And so maybe if you feel like it makes you the bad guy to acknowledge these things or to support, you know, or you know, not to oppose them, like maybe that's part of it. It's just like it's easier to say, oh no, there's no climate change, it's one big hoax, than to go, you know, my 40 years at the mill, like, weren't necessarily a great, you know, didn't necessarily produce a great outcome. I'm not sure that's what's there, but I suspect there's something like that. I don't know if that makes any sense to you.
And I'm sorry, we're running out of time, so we'll have to cut question period off right there. But I do want to thank Alex once more, please, if I could just join me in a round of applause. Thank you very much.